Arcane builds in Elden Ring can be some of the most overpowered and definitely some of the most fun builds that you can ever use, especially when you remember that Arcane dictates certain status effects in the game like bleed, poison and sleep, and if you make a build that purely focuses on those status effects, you can do things like this. So yes, this build is going to be a good one, so strap yourselves in and make sure that you give this video a like if you're excited, and without further ado, let's just jump straight into it. Now, just like I said in the intro there, with Arcane builds, they're extremely fun to use and also heavily rely on the status effects to deal their crazy amount of damage. That is because with most weapons, the Arcane stat directly dictates the amount of build up you deal with the respective elements. So of course, if you've got a bleed weapon, you will see at the bottom of your screen that it does a certain amount of bleed build up per hit, and like I say, increasing your arcane increases the amount of build up you do, making the bleed proc happen much quicker. Throw in the fact that you can also dual wield certain weapons and add different ashes of wars to increase that number further. You can be proccing things like bleed, poison and even sleep in literal seconds, making some of the hardest bosses in the game an absolute cakewalk as their health bars just literally diminish in front of your eyes. And also, just to give you reference, the gameplay that you're going to be seeing in the background is from my New Game Plus 6 character, but although we're in a higher New Game Plus, these status effects actually deal a certain percentage of your enemy's health bar, so although the boss's health is increasing, our damage output is also increasing, which is why bleed is such a crutch mechanic in this game. But of course, before we go any further, I should probably tell you the stats for this character, and you guys probably know the drill by now. It is a level 150 character, and as you can see, we've got 50 points into vigor, 15 points into mind, 24 endurance, 24 strength, 22 dexterity, 10 intelligence, 25 faith, and then 59 arcane. So yes, of course, with it being an ultimate arcane build, we are pumping pretty much everything we can into the arcane stat, but we do have 24 points into strength and 22 into dexterity to allow us to use certain weapons. That 24 strength specifically allows us to use Mohgwyn spear, because you can't really make an ultimate arcane build without using one of the best ashes of wars that relies on bleed damage. And that 22 dexterity pretty much allows us to use all of the quickest weapons in the game, whether that be fist weapons, twin blades or even curved swords, so that we can use those weapons and their high DPS to proc things like bleed and poison very quickly. Now, I'm just going to make it abundantly clear, of course, the setup for those DPS weapons is going to be completely different to the setup that's needed for things like Mohgwyn spear. In fact, Mohgwyn spear is the odd one out in the arcane category, so in this video I'm going to show you two setups, one specifically for Mohgwyn spear and then the other setup for any combination of weapons that you're utilizing DPS. So I'll show you the setup for Mohgwyn spear first, and I'm sure most of you already know the gimmick with this weapon, but we are going to be utilizing its insane Ash of War, the Blood Boon ritual. Essentially, whenever you use this Ash of War, you've got 3 phases where you can just fill the surrounding area with that red mist, which just so happens to deal thousands of damage, all whilst doing bleed proc as well. Where this is an AoE attack, this is of course brilliant for attacking multiple enemies at once, so certain boss fights this can be very good, like Commander O'Neill for instance. But the other beauty of this Ash of War is it can actually stagger human-like NPCs, and that does include Melania. But the other thing about Blood Boon is it's essentially Blood Flame, so it's also doing fire damage in the background along with everything else. Because of this, it's clear to see how you can deal so much damage so quickly, but as much as we rely on the Ash of War to deal that catastrophic amount of damage, it is still a great spear, so can still be viable to use just with the base moveset itself. It also has an extremely long reach, and after using the Ash of War, you will still have the Blood Flame effect on the end of the spear, so every time that you prod your enemies with a regular attack, you will also be hitting them with Blood Flame. And for those of you that don't know, Blood Flame has a lingering effect, so it will be constantly proccing bleed in the background. But in any case, with the original stats that I showed you earlier, I do recommend running running these talismans alongside it. And of course, where we're going to be using the Ash of War and basically cheesing the game with that, we would be very wise to use the Shard of Alexander, as that will boost the damage output with the Ash of War by 15%. But then we can also run the Fire Scorpion Charm, as that will also boost our damage output by 12%, because again it uses fire damage, before then using the Ritual Swords Talisman to give us a further 10% damage as long as we're at full HP, before then finishing it off with the Lord of Blood's Exaltation that gives us a plus 20% extra damage whenever a bleed proc occurs. And essentially with each use of the Ash of War in its 3 phases, you'll pretty much proc bleed every single use, which of course is just why you can deal so much damage with this thing. But then again, we've still got the Wonder Physic to boost our damage even more, and inside the Wonder Physic, I do highly recommend running the Flame Shrouding Crack Tier along with the Stone Barb Crack Tier, because as I say, it does fire damage, so again a 20% boost from the Flame Shrouding Crack Tier, but then the Stone Barb Crack Tier does come in clutch if we do use the base weapon itself, because it is still a great spear and it does a nice amount of stance damage, which will be boosted by 30% with the Stone Barb Crack Tier, which means you can break your enemy's poise in about 3 or 4 hits with a charged heavy attack, that is, which just makes the base weapon a little bit more viable. So for those of you that are fan of Mohg, or at least just fans of his Sacred Spear, that is the best setup that I advise you run with that particular weapon. But as we all know, arcane builds can be even more potent than that, especially when you power stance certain weapons, so dual wielding certain weapons like the Godskin Peeler and the Scavenger's Curve Swords, and make use of their unique quick attacks, especially their jumping attacks. So I am now going to show you the best setup for this DPS side of things, as I'm calling it, where we are relying on doing as many hits as physically possible to proc the bleed, poison, sleep, whatever it is that we're using, as quick as possible too. And of course, the first thing that we should mention is how we actually get these elements on those weapons, because for those of you that may have played Elden Ring before, you will know that the Godskin Peeler does not come with any affinity on it, but it is a common weapon to which we can apply any Ash of War. So as long as you get the Black Wet Blade from Nokron, located just here on the map as if you go to the Eternal City, you'll be able to change the weapon into a bleed type weapon, giving you around about 135 bleed proc. Throw in the fact that again we're going to be power stancing them, so you've got 2 of these weapons in your hands. That means you're going to have around about 270 bleed proc whenever you use a light attack with your left hand weapon, so pressing LB if you're on Xbox or L1 if you're on PlayStation. But if you thought that was good, the best part about using twin blades in these kinds of weapons is utilizing their jumping light attack. So again, if you press LB or L1 whilst you're jumping, you will do a flurry of attacks which can hit up to 5 or 6 times, and with that bleed build up that I just showed you there, that means you are pretty much going to proc bleed every time you use that jumping attack. So by rinse and repeating the same method, you're going to be able to annihilate pretty much any boss in the entire game. Again, this can be done with pretty much any base weapon in the game. The reason why twin blades are so good is because they provide the most amount of hits per jumping attack, which is why obviously they're the standout, but you can use other curve swords like the Bandit's Curve Sword or the Scavenger's Curve Swords that already come with a natural bleed affinity, and instead of making it a blood variant, make it an occult variant to get the most out of the arcane stat. But as I pointed out in the intro, bleed is not the only thing that gets affected by arcane, and there are a few weapons in the game like the Venomous Fang that have a natural poison affinity to them. So by doing the same thing like we did with the Godskin Peeler and turning the Venomous Fang into a bleed variant, you will keep that deadly poison on the weapon, as well as also adding the bleed effect to it, meaning that not only will you be proccing bleed every time that you hit an enemy with this weapon, but you will also poison them as well. One of the main Ashes of Wars that I advise you guys using is in fact going to be Cragblade, because whether you change your desired weapon into a bleed variant or an occult variant, if it's already got say bleed on the weapon, when you use the Cragblade Ash of War, you'll be increasing your base damage output by 15%, which is going to come in very handy along with these following talismans, because of course where we're focusing on DPS, I highly recommend that you run the Millicent's Prosthesis, as not only will you also get get a +5 in dexterity, helping with the base damage output as well, but you'll also get the first use of successive damage output. But then I also recommend running the Rotten Winged Insignia, as that'll give you a second boost to successive damage. But then again, where we're relying on bleed to be our main damage output, we can also use the Lord of Blood's Exaltation for the DPS side of things, as again we'll get that 20% extra damage boost whenever a bleed does occur. But then if you're also using a weapon that has either Scarlet Rot or Poison, like the Venomous Fang, then I highly recommend running the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, as again you'll get a further 20% whenever a poison or rot occurs. But if you are just purely using a weapon for bleed like the Godskin Peelers, then swap that Kindred of Rot Exaltation out for something like the Ritual Swords Talisman, as that will again give you a further plus 10% damage boost. And again, whether you're using strictly bleed or both poison and bleed, in the Wonder Physic I do recommend having the Thorny Crack tier, as I'll give a third boost to successive damage output, as well as running the Dexterity Knot tier to give a plus 10 to your dexterity, because again the additional dexterity is going to help out with your base damage output, especially whilst running the Cragblade Ash of War. So even against bosses like Radagon and the Elden Beast, who are going to be resistant to bleed, you are still going to have a very large amount of base damage, which is going to be boosted with those successive damage outputs and the Ritual Swords Talisman, along with the Cragblade as well. So you'll still be doing catastrophic numbers even without the bleed and poison. And then again, no matter what you're using, whether it's Mohgwyn Spear or any of these DPS options, where we've got 25 faith in this build, we can also run Golden Vow and Flamegrami Strength to give us the plus 15% extra damage output and the plus 20% extra damage output for physical damage. But we're also getting a boost from one of our pieces of armor, because for those of you that are keen-eyed, you've probably seen that we're running the White Mask, and whenever we do proc bleed, this will give a further 10% extra damage, stacking on top of the Lord of Blood's Exaltation. But then we've also paired the Silver Mask with the Raging Wolf armor and the Scaled Gauntlets and Greaves to give us that sort of like Blood Flame Knight kind of look. And like I say, no matter what route you go down, as long as you're using the right combinations that I've shown you in this video, you are going to be able to absolutely dominate any boss that Elden Ring has to offer, which is why I am deeming this as the ultimate Arcane build. But I want to know from you guys, do you agree? Are you a fan of Arcane builds? If so, obviously let me know in the comments, and let me know what your favourite weapon is to use whenever you are using an Arcane based build. And I do like to say this at the end of all of my videos, because the statement couldn't be more true, but I am not the best at Elden Ring, and I'm sure you guys have all kinds of suggestions to make this build even better. So if you do, feel free to also let us know in the comments down below any ways that you can make this build even better than what it already is. But if you have enjoyed this video or found it useful in any way, then I hope you don't mind me asking you to leave a like rating on this video. Not only does it help the channel out tremendously, but it's also the quickest way to tell me that you enjoy these videos and you want to see more overpowered builds like this in the future. And of course, the DLC is coming very, very soon, and obviously we are going to cover everything that the DLC has to offer. So if you want to stay tuned and up to date with everything that happens here, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll never miss a future video. But other than that, I've said everything that I need to, so hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. Obviously, thank you for making it all the way to the end, but go have fun with this build. Let me know how you get on, of course, but for now I guess I will catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.